blood-sucking, muscular, PVC-clad aristocrats, or war mongrels. Vampires. What are they? Are they real? What does science say? Welcome to Nature Shadow, and today we're looking at science and vampires. Early vampires had absolutely nothing to do with what we imagine vampires have anything to do with today. The early vampires were not these PVC-clad, neck-biting femme fatales. They were actually just the Walking Dead. Reports from 18th century Hamburg report of local people telling the orthodox medical professionals that corpses in the area just didn't decompose the way they're supposed to. They found that even after they'd buried certain people inside of the cemeteries and they were buried in that holy soil, that some of the corpses, if you looked at them later on, would still be pristine. Now, why it is that locals are wandering around Hamburg digging up dead bodies and checking if they're pristine or not, I have no idea. But reports suggest that people were telling medical professionals that people in the area just didn't seem to decompose the way that they would expect and the way that certain other bodies decomposed. This slow putrefaction of the bodies, it was believed, was indication that these particular people were vampires, and so the only way to deal with them was to either behead them or to burn them. But these 18th century vampires were not the first reports of vampires in history. As early as the 12th century, there was a particularly sinful, horrible individual who had died, and it was believed that at night time he would get up out of his grave and he would wander around the village and he would knock on the doors of certain homes. If he was to knock on your door in the evening, then somebody in that home would die within 24 hours. It was believed that he was spreading some sort of plague post his death. He would apparently run through the village, taunting all of the people, shouting as loud as he possibly could that he was going to continue knocking on doors and killing people until he was burned. So it's kind of nice of him to provide the locals with a solution to their problem. He was clearly trying to tell people, I'm going to keep killing you all unless you set me on fire. So was that his way of trying to make amends for being such a horrible person? Or was he just an idiot? I guess we'll never know. But these accounts from early history are accounts of vampires. People used to believe they were vampires. And the only way to deal with people that were spreading plague, that were sort of knocking on your door and trying to kill you off, or people that were raising up out of their graves, was to run a stake through their hearts, was to set them on fire, or was to behead them, which is all popular ways that we know of to sort of get rid of vampires. So this was early vampirism. But there is a more famous case, and so we're going to delve a little bit into the history of Vlad the Impaler. Quite possibly the most famous vampire and the inspiration behind Bram Stoker's Dracula, we come to Vlad the Impaler. Now, have we finally reached our blood-sucking vampire? No. Vlad the Impaler did not bite the necks of his enemies and drink their blood. So why was he a vampire? So it turns out the early history of Vlad is one of war and family issues. His dad, who seemed to be a really nice guy, decided that in order to save himself, he was going to sacrifice his sons. And so his sons were, him and his sons were captured. There was like a civil war going on at the time in the 1400s, 13 and 1400s. And they were captured. Now, Vlad II, who is Vlad the Impaler's dad, said that the Turkish people could keep his sons, keep them in prison for as long as they wanted, as long as he was allowed to escape. And so escape he did. So he was a great guy. So Vlad the Impaler had some daddy issues. His dad was overall not a great guy, and so he held a position of aristocracy in the local area, but he lost that through the civil wars that were going on. Their family lost their position in society when his dad was ousted in 1447 and lost the title of Voivode of Wallachia. Hopefully I've said those words right. But Vlad came back with a vengeance, and in 1448 he was absolutely determined to take back his title and to take back his place in society. So his dad had been ousted, but Vlad III was determined to take over the environment and take back what was originally his. Unfortunately, much like his dad, Vlad III was unsuccessful in his attempts, and at some point between 1448 and 1456 he swapped sides. So he decided to side with the enemy, which seemed to be the better choice for our young Vlad, who wanted to take back his high society position. In 1456, the kind and gentle Vlad, as we know him, decided that he was done paying for the Ottoman Empire. He wanted nothing more to do with it anymore. By this point, he had taken back his seat, and he was considered somebody of high authority in the Hungarian army and the Hungarian society. And so he decided he wasn't going to pay anymore into this Ottoman Empire. And so he decided to invite everybody around. Let's have a nice meal. Let's all have a get together. Let's sort this thing out. And instead of just leaving it there, our lovely Vlad decided to kill and impale everybody at that meal. Now, reports say that there were 500 people. Estimations put down it was likely to be 50 people. Either way, somewhere between 50 and 500 people found themselves becoming some really quite sick and twisted garden ornaments for Vlad the Impaler. Now, this bloodthirsty Vlad was our Dracula, but he did not drink the blood of his enemies. There seems to have been some sort of lost in translation stuff where he was just very bloodthirsty and just quite annoyed. He was annoyed with everything that had happened, but he is at least our first member of gentry that enters our Dracula lexicon. So where does the name Dracula come from? Was Vlad Dracula? It would appear that the name Dracula actually has pretty benign origins. So in Old Romanian, which is the language that Vlad would have spoken, Drac was the name of his like family surname, which meant dragon. And as he was son of Drac, he was Dracul, so son of Drac, which is Old Romanian for son of dragon. And so that then translated into Dracula later on. So Vlad was Dracula. Dracula for us conjures up images of a very different thing. But Vlad was a Dracula. So if vampirism was real, there are graves that mark out for vampires, but vampires were just walking dead people, or particularly angry people. Where did the PVC-clad, biting neck, drinking blood type thing come from? And here we have literature to thank. The very first reference to a neck-biting vampire comes from a poem from 1748. And then we go to our most famous piece of literature where we start to talk about vampires as these creatures of the night that would come into your bedroom and bite your neck and drink your blood, which is Bram Stoker's Dracula from 1897. But let's be real, if you think of the word vampire, you, like me, probably think about something like this. So, let's look at the science. Could a humanoid creature survive purely on blood? Could we have our PVC-clad neck-biting vampires? Could they exist? Let's look to science. Probably the most recognizable blood-sucking creature outside of mosquitoes is the vampire bat. Now, the vampire bat is the only mammalian species that consumes only blood. These are very small creatures, so they weigh about 2 ounces, and they live in large colonies, so anywhere between 10 and 100,000 odd individuals all live together in one sort of social group. So they're quite a social, quite a social creature. It's quite nice to know that there could be 100,000 vampire bats just flying around, smelling for blood. It's quite the image. And unlike most bats, these bats are very comfortable on the ground. They can fly, as all bats do, but they're very agile on the ground. And quite often what they prefer to do is crawl around on the ground, crawl up to their prey and get quite close. They have quite dexterous hands, and they can leap up onto the animal, crawl up and start to feed. That's nice. So as I mentioned, vampire bats are the only mammalian species that survive on blood. So the only mammal species that survive on blood. But how do they do it? So researchers have been looking at the genetics of vampire bats to try and work out how they do it. How are they different, and how can they survive purely on blood alone? And what they have found is vampire bats have certain genetic information that's really quite distinct and quite unusual when it comes to bats in general. One research group found that vampire bats have lost their sort of sense of taste, which is why the researchers had sort of implied that they drink blood. They sort of can't really taste anything. So they've lost that ability to sort of distinguish between like bitter and sweet and stuff through their genetic information. I suppose it's the only way that we can imagine finding blood to be tasteful is if you couldn't actually taste it. In order to sustain themselves, bats need to consume up to 1.5 times their body weight a day in blood. Because blood has so few calories, it's mostly liquid, obviously, but the dry matter is mostly made up of proteins, and there are very few carbs. So blood is like 98% protein and 1% carbohydrates. So please don't any bodybuilding, muscle-clad people sort of try and think that drinking blood is going to give you like 98% protein. It's not really how it works, and there's quite a lot in blood that you don't want inside your body. So this is not a health advert for like how to up your protein gains. But blood has quite a lot of protein in it. However, it also contains a lot of iron. And so another part of the genetic changes that vampire bats have is the ability to be able to consume blood and take the tiny calories out of it without suffering from a fatal dose of iron, which is what they would have given how much blood they need to consume to sustain their tiny body size. So could a humanoid survive on blood? Firstly, we'd have to consider their mouth parts. So during human evolution, we have evolved to have mouth parts, teeth, and digestive systems, facial muscles, and skull structure, all to consume the types of foods that we eat. And so a lot of evolution is actually down to eating, excreting, and breeding. And so most evolution and adaptation to the environment are based on those three sort of core things that you need to be able to do. So the vampire would not have the same sort of face structure, mouth parts, or digestive system that we would have, because it would need to be able to consume something that we have never been evolved to consume previously. So the first main adaptation when we look at vampire bats are their teeth. And so if we were looking at our humanoid to have vampire teeth, it would need to have teeth that could bite into skin to be able to draw out some blood. Now, humans, we do not have teeth that are sharp enough. Also, our teeth are covered in this protective enamel. Now, that enamel means that our teeth are not sharp, and so they would not ever be sharp enough to break skin. Vampire bats have two incredibly sharp, very pointy teeth with no enamel. And what they use these teeth for is to cut away the hairs on the animal and then to make a small, tight incision. The vampire bat also has inside the saliva an antiseptic and an anticoagulation sort of property, and also it has an anesthetic. So what that does is it numbs the area so the animal has no idea that it's being bitten. And it also produces saliva that prevents the blood from clotting. So the bat can just sort of sit there, and usually a bat will sort of sit on its host for about half an hour, to like say 30 minutes, consuming as much blood as it needs. So our humanoid creature would need to have teeth with no enamel that are able to make sharp incisions into human skin to be able to draw up a meal, or maybe an animal. Perhaps if our humanoid vampires were to consume the blood of animals. Vampire bats also have heat receptors inside the nose, and so they are able to locate where blood is closest to the surface of the skin. Vampire bats are also very, very small, and so, as I've mentioned, they're 2 ounces, they're tiny bats, and so they can go largely undetected. They quite often like to be around livestock, around sleeping livestock, or livestock that's lying down. So if you think of a very sort of small bat onside the back of a horse or a cow or something, like the animal isn't really going to notice, especially given the other properties that this bat has inside of its blood to help the animal not notice that they're there. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm pretty certain I would notice if a 6-foot man came and sat on my lap and started to bite my neck. So I don't know exactly how our humanoid bat would be able to get over being recognized and then pushed away by their prey or victim. The only way that I imagine that this could work is they would need to have some sort of anesthetic inside their blood, or inside their saliva rather, that they put into their host before they start to bite their host. So, as I mentioned, I'm going to notice someone walking up behind me and biting my neck. However, maybe if they had some sort of secretory gland where they could maybe grab their host and subdue their host before then biting their host with this anesthetic and then this anticoagulant, then potentially a humanoid could bite onto another human and use them as a host. The only other issue that we have is the amount of blood that needs to be consumed. So one humanoid that was the same size and shape, I mean, let's look at most vampires. They're pretty bulky people. They're pretty muscular. To try and sustain that body weight, you trying to consume 1.5 times your body weight. If there was a 6-foot guy and he's a bodybuilder and he bites my neck, let's be honest, I'm 5'2". He's going to drain all of the blood out of my body and still have room for more. So our humanoid vampires are either going to need to bite lots of people and take an amount of blood, or completely drain people of their blood and maybe consume fewer people in one evening. But they would need to do this every single day to try and sustain themselves. Could a humanoid be a vampire? I think the evidence, when we look at other species that consume blood and humans, the evidence is no, right? A vampire would not be able to sustain itself on blood alone. It would need to consume other foodstuffs and maybe take blood in as additional nutrients. You can't really say calories, there's no calories in it, so maybe they would need the nutrients, maybe they would need the iron that's inside of the blood, and so they would need a portion of blood to be able to top up their iron. So maybe humanoid vampires are just anemic people, or anemic humanoids that need a little bit of extra iron and so turn to vampirism. However, with that said, there might very well be vampires walking around in your local area right now. Vampirism is a very real condition. There is a syndrome called Renfield's syndrome. Now, this is believed to be more of a mental health condition, and it is sometimes associated with schizophrenia. But some people, those suffering from Renfield syndrome, have delusions of vampirism, and they either practice self-vampirism, so they consume their own blood, or they just have a massive compulsion to bite other people and to suck their blood. So human vampires existed years ago in the Dark Ages, but they were considered to be the Walking Dead. But they do exist today in this day and age, but it is deemed to be a mental health illness. So vampires are real, according to science. So sleep well tonight, my dear viewer. Sleep with your curtains and your windows closed, and maybe wear that turtleneck, because vampires are real. Thank you so much for choosing to watch this video. I do hope you have enjoyed it. Please let me know down in the comments below what you think of vampirism. There was a documentary a few years ago actually talking about people that felt very drawn to vampirism. Do you feel it is something that you would be drawn to? Is it the aesthetic that you are drawn to, that sort of more gothic aesthetic? Or do you know somebody, or have you ever heard of Renfield syndrome? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. Next time we're going to be doing a deep dive into science and mermaids.